Modern airliners are engineered around a simple philosophy. Humans make mistakes, so machines must catch them. If cabin pressure drops, alarms sound. If altitude becomes dangerous, oxygen masks deploy automatically. If something is misconfigured, warning systems intervene. Checklists exist for one reason: to prevent a small oversight from becoming a catastrophe. But every system, no matter how sophisticated, depends on one final safeguard: the crew. On August 14, 2005, that final safeguard failed, and an aircraft flew itself for hours, carrying 121 people who were no longer conscious. The hidden setup: the tragedy of Helios Airways. Flight 522 did not begin in the air. It began the night before. The Boeing 737-300 had returned from London to Larnaca without incident. During that flight, the crew reported hearing a loud noise near a service door. It suggested a possible pressurization leak, not uncommon, not alarming, but worth checking. Maintenance performed a ground pressurization test. To conduct that test, the pressurization mode selector must be placed in manual. In that setting, engineers directly control the outflow valve to simulate cabin pressure conditions. The test found no significant leak. The paperwork was signed off. The aircraft was released. But one small detail did not return to normal. The pressurization selector remained in manual. It was not a mechanical failure. It was not sabotage. It was not a broken system. It was simply not switched back. In accident investigation terminology, this is called a latent error, a dormant condition waiting for the right environment to become deadly. The right environment arrived the next morning. The climb no one felt. At 6:07 a.m., Flight 522 departed Larnaca. On board, 115 passengers, including 22 children and 6 crew members. The cockpit was staffed by experienced pilots. Nothing in their records suggested recklessness or incompetence. The takeoff was normal. The climb was normal. But because the selector was still in manual, the outflow valve did not automatically regulate cabin pressure. As the aircraft climbed, cabin altitude climbed with it. There was no explosive decompression, no dramatic event, just a slow, invisible rise. At 10,000 feet cabin altitude, the warning horn sounded. Here lies one of the most tragic design flaws in commercial aviation history. On this generation of Boeing 737, the cabin altitude warning horn sounded exactly the same as the takeoff configuration warning horn. Identical tone, identical urgency, different meaning. The crew believed they were hearing a takeoff configuration warning, something that should never occur in flight, and therefore likely a systems anomaly. They began troubleshooting. They did not don oxygen masks. They did not descend. Meanwhile, hypoxia had already begun its silent work. Hypoxia, the quiet killer. Hypoxia is not dramatic. It does not feel like suffocation. It does not trigger primal panic. Instead, it creates confusion, mild disorientation, subtle cognitive impairment, a false sense of calm. At 18,000 feet, cabin altitude, useful consciousness can be measured in minutes. The human brain loses higher reasoning first, then judgment, then awareness. The person affected rarely realizes it is happening. By the time passengers' oxygen masks deployed automatically, the crew's cognitive ability was already deteriorating. Passenger oxygen masks provide roughly 12 to 15 minutes of oxygen, long enough for an emergency descent. But there was no descent. The aircraft continued climbing to 34,000 feet. The autopilot leveled off at cruise altitude, and within minutes, everyone on board, pilots, passengers, cabin crew, was succumbing to oxygen deprivation. The Ghost Flight Air Traffic Control began noticing something strange. The aircraft was flying perfectly, speed stable, altitude stable, heading precise, but it was not responding. Repeated calls went unanswered. Handoffs between sectors failed. Greek authorities scrambled F-16 fighters to intercept. What they saw would define the term ghost flight. Through the cockpit window, the first officer was slumped over the controls. The captain was not visible. In the cabin, rows of oxygen masks hung limp. Passengers were motionless. The aircraft was alive. The people inside were not. Yet the Boeing 737 continued flying flawlessly. Automation does not require oxygen. circling on borrowed time. Instead of descending into Athens, the flight management system entered a holding pattern, a racetrack loop programmed to maintain position until further instructions that would never come. For more than an hour, the aircraft circled at 34,000 feet, burning fuel. On the ground, authorities faced an unthinkable calculation. When fuel runs out, engines flame out. When engines flame out, thrust disappears. When thrust disappears, a 60-ton aircraft becomes a glider, and someone must be at the controls. But no one was. The final human act. Then, at approximately 11:48 a.m., something changed. An F-16 pilot saw movement in the cockpit. A man entered and sat in the captain's seat. He was wearing a full oxygen mask. He was identified later as Andreas Prodromou, a flight attendant with a private pilot license. He had been traveling off-duty as a passenger. Somehow, he regained consciousness, accessed portable oxygen, and forced his way into the cockpit. He made eye contact with the fighter pilot. The fighter signaled instructions. Prodromou pointed downward, a simple gesture. "We are going down." He was not a Boeing 737 pilot. He had never trained in jet operations. But he tried. That matters. Fuel exhaustion. Moments later, the first engine failed, then the second. At cruise altitude, losing one engine is manageable for a trained crew. Losing both is catastrophic. Without engine thrust, hydraulic pressure degrades. Electrical systems shift to minimal backup. Control authority weakens. The aircraft must descend. Prodromou attempted to control the descent. Flight data later showed irregular turns and pitch changes, evidence that someone was actively manipulating the controls. He was fighting physics. A Boeing 737 at 34,000 feet requires energy management precision. Glide range depends on speed, configuration, and aerodynamic stability. Prodromou had none of the training required for that scenario. He tried to stretch the glide, he tried to maneuver, but without power, altitude is time, and time was gone. At 12:03 p.m., Flight 522 impacted a hillside near Grammatiko, Greece. 121 lives were lost. Expanded analysis. Why this accident changed aviation. Helios Flight 522 became one of the most studied aviation disasters in modern history. Not because of fire, not because of structural failure, not because of terrorism, but because the aircraft itself never failed. It worked exactly as designed. The automation was flawless. The failure was systemic. The Swiss cheese alignment investigators applied the Swiss cheese model. Layers of defense, each with potential weaknesses. Layer 1, maintenance. The selector left in manual. No explicit verification step required in documentation. Layer 2, pre-flight checklist. The selector was visually scanned but not consciously verified. Expectation bias masked the abnormal setting. Layer 3, warning design. Identical horn tones created ambiguity at the worst possible moment. Layer 4, training limited exposure to real cabin altitude warning scenarios. Layer 5, human physiology. Hypoxia erodes the exact cognitive functions required to recover from misidentification. Each layer alone was survivable. Together, they aligned perfectly. The psychological dimension. One of the most haunting findings. Many passengers likely remained physiologically alive until impact. Their hearts may have still been beating, but their consciousness was gone. Hypoxia does not feel like dying. It often feels like calm. It steals awareness before fear. In many ways, this accident is a case study in how dangerous silent failure can be. A violent explosion demands attention. A slow decline does not. Legal and cultural aftermath executives, engineers, and operational leaders faced prosecution in both Cyprus and Greece. Legal outcomes were mixed and controversial, but the aviation industry did respond. Warning systems were redesigned to ensure clearer differentiation. Training emphasized immediate oxygen mask application when any cabin altitude warning occurs. Maintenance verification procedures were tightened. Human factors research gained renewed urgency. Flight 522 reshaped thinking about cognitive overload, alarm ambiguity, automation dependency, physiological limits in high-altitude flight. the central horror, what makes this accident uniquely chilling, is this. For more than 2 hours, the aircraft was not crashing. It was flying perfectly. If you had looked at radar alone, you would have seen nothing unusual. If you had stood beneath it, you would have seen a normal airliner against a blue sky. Inside, however, consciousness had already faded. The autopilot does not know whether anyone is alive. It simply follows its programming. And on that morning, programming outlived humanity. 2 decades later, Helios Flight 522 remains a permanent lesson in aviation safety. Not about dramatic failure, but about small assumptions. About how expectation can override observation. About how the brain, deprived of oxygen, becomes certain precisely when it should doubt itself. And about how a perfectly functioning machine can carry tragedy in absolute silence.